Let us pray. Gracious and holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts, wherever it is we are gathering this morning, be acceptable in your sight, you who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. It is a shame that among all his rare endowments, among them is not the gift of illustration. It is a shame that of all his rare endowments, among them is not the gift of illustration. This is what a critic said about Paul Cézanne's work in the middle of his life. Not really what you want to hear as an artist. Like, he's got some really interesting gifts, he just can't draw. Unfortunately, this marked Cézanne and his art for almost all of his life. He had a best friend, Émile Zola, who wrote a novel, and everybody knew that the protagonist of the novel was a stand-in for his friend Cézanne. And Zola, the novel's called L'Oeuvre, the work. At the very end of it, judges his whole work, whole Louvre, as an artistic failure. With friends like that, yeah, the friendship ended on that one. The sad truth for Paul Cézanne is that for almost all of his artistic life, for 5 decades, he painted and painted and painted and struggled and could really see no promise in what he was doing. It wasn't until the very end of his life that people saw the greatness of his work. Cézanne was a late bloomer. This is also what we see in the text that I read in the Gospel of Luke, these 2 disciples on the road. They are not just latecomers to the story, but they are also late bloomers. The Gospel of Luke is my favorite of all the Gospels. When I was in undergrad, I was a classics major, and I did an undergraduate thesis on the magical tradition in Luke and Acts. You can email me if you're actually interested in that. And one of the joys of that work is I got to translate the entire Gospel of Luke and then the second volume that Luke wrote called the Book of Acts. And it gave me this incredible appreciation for Luke's use of language. Nothing happens by accident in Luke. Now, take the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is like a beat novel. It is fast, the sentences are short, and there are all these Hebraisms. So these Greek words that are kind of loan words from Hebrew. So it's like Greek with a Hebrew accent. And everything's it's always happening immediately, kaiuthus, immediately. Matthew, very, very different. Matthew's writing about 20 years after Mark, and Matthew has Mark on his desk. We know this because there are just parts of Mark that are verbatim in Matthew. But Matthew doesn't just take them whole cloth. He'll rip out little pieces, and then he'll stitch those together. So Matthew actually will take sayings that are independent in Mark, and he'll create a sermon for Jesus. And it's not just any sermon, but it's a sermon on, well, what? A mount. And that infancy story that Matthew has, Jesus' family goes to Egypt, and then there's an exodus from Egypt. So you have an exodus from Egypt, and then a sermon on a mountain where he interprets or re-gives the law. Who's Matthew making Jesus out to sound like? It's like a new Moses, because Matthew's speaking to that kind of community. Luke's completely different. Luke is speaking to a much more Greek community, and he leverages his use of the language to the hilt. Luke has this amazing ability to shift the kinds of Greek that he uses. These are things you don't notice in English. But like the first 2 chapters of Luke, you have the infancy narrative, the story of Jesus' birth. But Luke shifts the language because it's happening in a time long ago, and it's all set in the temple. He uses the language of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And like, to use an analogy today, it would be like if I started speaking in King James English. You could, understand what I'm saying, but it wouldn't be easier. No, that was terrible. That was terrible. Something like, you know what I mean. So Luke shifts and uses this kind of old, antique-sounding Greek that people would have understood, but they would know what he was doing. And then he uses very plain, what's called koine or common Greek that's beautiful prose. But then he'll have moments like in Acts when Paul is speaking to the philosophers in the Agora of Athens. And he uses almost an Attic Greek, which is what the philosophers used in 5th century, in the 5th century. And it would sound like you were dropped into a philosophy seminar. Like you're hearing words like hermeneutic and epistemological. And you're just like, what is that? You're listening for your name at that point. You're trying to hold on. So Luke is amazing, and he's very careful about his language, and there are no accidents. There are no accidents in the text, which is why these two characters are so interesting, because they just come out of nowhere. I mean, we've had Jesus's birth. We watched him in Luke in the Galilee doing healings and teachings. We had the disciples. He's named all of these people. And then the Passover. We've never heard of these two, and yet here they are, and there's an intense focus on them. Not only will we see are they late comers to this narrative, but they're late bloomers. Jesus even calls them slow of heart in the text itself. The thing with late bloomers that's challenging is that it upends an assumption that most of us make about whether we're made for a certain work or art or season of life. Most of us have this built-in assumption, it's just unspoken, but we have this feeling that if we're really made for a certain work or art or season of life, that when we start trying it, when we start engaging it, that there'll be some sense in which it will come easily to us. I mean, maybe we won't be like a Mozart-level genius. We don't expect that. But we'll expect some sense of facility with what we're engaging. Things will come somewhat easily for us, that we don't have to struggle. Struggle for us is often a sign that we think we're on the wrong path. And this notion of late blooming challenges that. There's a guy named David Galenson who's actually studied all of these people, both in the arts and other disciplines, but he started with poets. There was a belief in poetry that if you didn't create your best work by 20, you're kind of done. And so he surveyed thousands and thousands of poets and looking at, when they did their best work or not. And he came up with numbers like this for masterworks. Some people came up with it when they were 25, others 72, 14, 38. Like, if you're not sensing any pattern in these numbers, it's because David Galenson says there is none. In fact, the only pattern that he could see is that most people are actually not very good at their craft when they're starting out, and they have to go through a long period of struggle and work and difficulty until finally they begin to have, some sense of facility. And it's not that the world wasn't just ready for them. Sometimes we have that myth, like the Van Gogh thing, where he was a genius, but no one could see it. Galenson says, no, the truth is that actually when you look at these people, they weren't that good. That's what critics, even today, they look at Paul Cézanne's like whole oeuvre of art, even through the lens of him as a master, and they go back to his work as a younger man and are like, meh. He just wasn't that good. And he had to keep working and struggling and grinding. And that's where we are with these two disciples that we have in Luke. Cleopas and this unnamed disciple, they, like us, are walking along when their world is completely upended. And they had followed Jesus and all the disciples into Jerusalem at the Passover, and they had seen Jesus do all of these amazing things, and I'm sure they kept thinking he would pull one more rabbit out of the hat, and then they watched him get arrested, they watched him be crucified, they watched him die. And now it's been 3 days, and their entire world, they left their homes and their families and their jobs, and now they have no idea where it is that they're headed. It's precisely what we're experiencing. And now they're on the road and they're talking with each other, And then Jesus shows up in their midst, and they don't even recognize him. Now, some people kind of have this sense of, oh, there's some magic that keeps them from seeing Jesus, maybe. Grief and anxiety, it also keeps us from seeing goodness around us in our lives. These two are on the road, and they're consumed with talking about what happened like we are. I mean, it's unlikely that all of our conversations about COVID-19 are really going to change anything, but it's not like we can't stop talking about it because it's happening to us. And Jesus showing up like this and being like, hey, what are you talking about? That would be like us being in the Fred Meyer, and you're shopping, you've got your mask, and some dude in a Hawaiian shirt coming over and being like, hey, what's with the mask? And you're like, are you the only one in Tualatin who doesn't? And so they're kind of frustrated with him, but they're not recognizing him. And then they admit something really interesting. They're telling him all the things that happened, and they say, and the women, well, they did go down to the tomb, and they had this weird vision and said that he's still alive, but they don't believe it. Like, these people were there. They heard the gospel preached for the first time, completely didn't believe it. In fact, Luke uses a really strong word when the women give the story to the men, and they call it lyra in Greek. And it's translated in this wimpy translation as an idle tale. But in Koine Greek, lyra is not a nice word. It is not a word one uses in church, although it's in the Bible, which is interesting. The word means BS. The women give this story. They preach the sermon of the gospel for the first time, and the disciples are like, right. So that's what they say to Jesus. Then that's when he's like, oh, how slow of heart can you be? And he goes through all of the scriptures that he had already gone over them with before, and they're still not getting it. Right? So they see Jesus, they hear the gospel preached, and then he's giving them a Bible lesson. Like, Jesus is your Old Testament teacher. That's amazing. And they're still not getting it at all until the very end of the night, when they go into that little room and they bless bread and they break it. And that's when their eyes are open. Probably my favorite moment there is when Cleopas is like, and weren't our hearts burning on the road the whole time, as if he's pretending like he actually knew it, which reminds me of the Lego movie, where Lego Batman, he's like every 6-year-old boy. He's using his batarangs to try to hit this switch, and he's like, whoosh, misses, whoosh, whoosh. He does it like 7 times. Finally, whoosh, he hits it, and he's like, first try. That's how these disciples are. They didn't get anything the entire way. And that's our story. Their story is our story. We are trying to live in a time when the entire world is upside down. None of us have any idea quite where it is that we are heading. And I've noticed a shift, at least in speaking with some of you and caring for some of the people in my world. I've seen a shift in us. I think the first couple of weeks, we had some energy for this. We had some fight for this. Things were new. We were rolling up our sleeves. We're like, okay, we can do this, people. And we are now entering into the 6th week of this, at least around these parts. And I'm feeling a lot of fatigue. I'm feeling it personally, but I'm also hearing from people that we're just tired and we're exhausted, and we don't know what's coming ahead. And I'm also hearing something a little bit different, which is not just concern or fatigue about the situation, but there's also judgment about themselves. There's judgment about yourself, about how you're feeling about that. People have said to me, like, what's wrong with me? My friends are like trying to be positive and they're trying to see good things, but I'm just exhausted and I can't. Like, what's wrong with me? If there's anything I have learned doing this work, it's that you are so hard on yourself. You are so hard on yourself. You can be hard on others. I've seen you can be a little judgmental towards others, but you reserve your most searing and biting words and criticism for yourself. And what I want you to hear this morning is that it's not true that if you're made for this season, if you're made for this time, that somehow it's just going to be and come quickly for you. The truth is that this season, we're learning to live not knowing what's happening and not knowing where we're going. And we've never had to do that before. And maybe it felt okay at first because we had this energy, but now we're really beginning to feel it, and it's hard. And if it's hard and you're struggling, that does not mean that there's something wrong with you. It means that this season is really, really difficult, and you're feeling it like I am, like everyone is. Malcolm Gladwell says that every late blooming story is a love story. When it came to Paul Cézanne, he had a father named Auguste Philippe Cézanne, and Auguste Philippe hated his son's art. He didn't like it. He didn't understand it. He made him get a law degree at one point because he was just like, son, you might want to have a day job. And a lot of people today, like they look back and they are critical of Auguste and like, how could he not recognize the genius in his son? But the truth is, Auguste loved his son. And he actually gave him a stipend his entire life, even when he was producing mediocre art. He gave him a stipend that allowed him to continue to do that art. His father didn't understand what his son was doing. He didn't like it, but he also supported it. Every late blooming story that's a love story means that we don't get through this alone. We get through it with help from others, from friends, from communities, from the holy. I said there were no accidents in Luke. Luke does not leave the second disciple unnamed as an accident. He names Cleopas, and the other one's name is left blank. And that is so that you and I can put our names in that blank. The reality is that we are just like them. We hear good news and we don't believe it. Sometimes the presence of the holy is right in front of our eyes, but because we're grieving and anxious, we don't see it. And I don't know how many times you could go through the scriptures and not completely understand everything, but that's us. And the most lovely thing about this story for me is that, yes, Jesus does call them slow of heart, but even when they don't recognize him, he does not leave them. Even when they admit that they heard the gospel preached and they don't believe it, he does not leave them. And even when he goes through all the lessons he's already been through 1,000,000 times and they still don't get it, he does not leave them. If you are struggling, if you are not sure if you're made for this season because of that, if you aren't sure that you believe in all of these crazy stories about resurrection, and you can be hard on yourself. You can be critical of yourself. You can rake yourself over the coals for that all you want. And when you are tired of that, when you are done with that, and you look up, you will find a hand that is reaching out to you. And that will be the hand of the Good Shepherd, who, whether all of this stuff makes sense to you or not, never leaves you. Who, whether you hear this story and believe it, or you think it's Lyra, never leaves you. And who abides with us until the moment comes, and it does come, when we finally have that glimpse of ourselves and we see in ourselves all the things that he's already known. Amen.